Some towns don't collapse with sirens, they rot beneath silence, stitched together by fear and forged signatures. Pine Hollow was that kind of town. Justice wore a crooked smile and people vanished without a sound. Then she arrived quiet, alone, unarmed. They stopped her, falsely accused her, tossed her in a cell like countless others before her. But they didn't check her ID, didn't see the federal badge, didn't realize the woman they tried to bury was a U.S. prosecutor trained to dismantle corruption. They thought they were silencing her, but they handed her the match, and the whole system. It was already dry, kindling. You're about to witness the fire they couldn't stop. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Denise Walker didn't plan on stopping in Pine Hollow County. She hadn't even planned on leaving the interstate that afternoon, but the GPS rerouted her after a jackknifed semi blocked the main highway. She was just hours into what was supposed to be a quiet road trip, a rare moment of breath before stepping into the highest profile position of her career. The sun hung low over the desert hills, throwing long shadows across the blacktop as her old sedan hummed steadily beneath her hands. Her suitcase was in the trunk, her DOJ badge zipped in a leather pouch under the passenger seat, and a half-finished cup of gas station coffee sat lukewarm in the cup holder. Everything about this drive felt like liminal space between old chapters and new, between who she had to be and who she hoped to become. The moment she crossed the county line, though, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The road narrowed, the trees thinned, and the radio hissed into static before cutting out completely. A billboard greeted her with faded letters peeling at the corners. "Welcome to Pine Hollow, God's country, our rules." She blinked, took her foot off the gas for a moment, then laughed quietly to herself. "Charming," she muttered, adjusting her sunglasses. But that little twinge at the base of her neck, that slight tightening in her chest didn't go away. It was just supposed to be a stretch-your-legs kind of stop. She noticed the diner off a dusty pull-off road, its old neon sign sputtering over the words, "Sonny's Place, best pie in the state." The parking lot held only 3 trucks and a rusted-out patrol cruiser all caked in red dirt. Denise pulled in, carefully glancing at the gas gauge, half a tank left. Enough to keep going if she needed to. She checked her phone again. No signal. The dots on her map had frozen 5 miles back. A deep breath didn't help. Her hand lingered a second, longer than it should have, on the key in the ignition. Inside, the diner smelled of bacon, grease, and sour coffee left too long on the burner. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, doing little more than stirring up the heat. 3 men sat at the far counter in matching camo jackets, ball caps pulled, low eyes fixed on her. The second the bell above the door jingled. Their stare wasn't curious. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that said you didn't belong, and they were ready to remind you if you forgot. Denise straightened her spine, let the door swing shut behind her, and walked toward a booth by the window. She didn't need to be told what this was. She'd been the first black girl in her AP class, the only black associate in a DC law firm for 5 years straight, and the youngest trial supervisor in her division. She knew the art of holding your head high without ever seeming like you were looking down on anyone. She knew how to be unthreatening but unshakable. And still, when the waitress came over, a white woman in her 60s with a smoker's voice and no name tag, Denise could feel the edge in her tone. "Coffee?" she asked flatly. Denise nodded once. "And just a BLT, please." The woman scribbled something on her pad that looked more like a doodle than an order and walked away without another word. Denise watched her go, then turned back toward the window. Her reflection looked tired, graying coils pinned in a low bun, deep lines at the corners of her eyes, the fitted navy blazer suddenly too formal for a place like this. She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to focus on the small things. The hum of the freezer behind the counter, the whine of a fly trapped against the glass, the quiet sound of tires crunching into the gravel outside. The voices behind her were low but unmistakable. Should have kept driving. Yep. Another one looking to stir things up. She didn't turn around, didn't even blink. The coffee arrived with a clatter sloshing onto the saucer. The waitress smirked and walked off. Denise reached for a napkin and dabbed her fingers clean, then folded her hands in her lap. She could feel her pulse rising, could feel the weight of her badge tucked beneath her coat, and reminded herself it wasn't time to play that card, not yet. When she stood to use the restroom, one of the men stood too. It wasn't coincidence. He stepped into her path tall and broad, with a beer belly stretching his shirt tight. "Where you from?" he asked, lips curling into a grin that didn't touch his eyes. Denise looked him in the eye, calm but firm. "I'm just passing through." He sniffed, took a step closer. "Figures. Folks like you always are." She said nothing, just tilted her head slightly, letting silence do the work. Eventually he stepped aside. She walked past him, her heels echoing on the worn tile floor. When she returned to her booth, her sandwich was there untouched. The waitress was gone. The counter crew had gone quiet. Denise sat, took one bite, then pushed the plate away. It wasn't the words or the coffee or the silence that got to her. It was the heat behind every stare, like they were all waiting for her to break character, waiting for her to flinch. But she didn't flinch. Not yet. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that by sunrise the next day, the name Denise Walker would no longer be just a stranger passing through. Pine Hollow would remember her, whether they liked it or not. The next morning, Denise Walker was pulled from her sleep by the jarring clang of a metal door and the gruff voice of a deputy telling her to get up and move. She hadn't slept much anyway. Her cot had been nothing more than a metal slab with a sheet that smelled faintly of bleach and something older, sadder, buried beneath the surface. Her back ached from the cold, and her wrists were still red from the too tight cuffs they'd used when they first brought her in the night before. She sat up slowly, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light overhead, and instinctively reached to smooth her blouse, only to remember they hadn't let her change. Her blazer was gone, and so was her phone. Her badge, she assumed, was still zipped inside the case under the passenger seat of her locked car, which they'd towed for investigation. The deputy waiting at the door was young, maybe late 20s, with sandy hair and a nervous look in his eyes, like he knew something wasn't right but didn't know what to do about it. He didn't meet her gaze when he handed her a paper cup of lukewarm water and gestured toward the hallway. "Judge wants to see you. Says no delay." His voice cracked slightly, and she almost asked his name, but something told her it wouldn't matter. So she nodded once and followed him, the soles of her shoes sticking slightly with each step against the scuffed linoleum floors. They led her down a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of mold and coffee gone bitter, past bulletin boards littered with outdated flyers and crooked photos of fishing tournaments and county fairs. Every door they passed was shut, every window shaded, as if the entire building was bracing for something it didn't want to acknowledge. Denise kept her chin level, her stride measured, but inside her thoughts moved like floodwater. She was being rushed through due process, with no phone call, no lawyer, no explanation. The paperwork they'd shoved at her last night was vague, something about disturbing the peace and possible assault. They hadn't mentioned a hearing, let alone one so soon, and the only explanation she could imagine was that someone wanted this buried before it had a chance to rise. The courtroom was smaller than she expected, more like a community rec room than a seat of justice. The walls were covered in faded wood paneling, the floor carpeted in a brown so dull it seemed to drain the light from the windows. A few townspeople sat scattered across the pews, most of them older men in denim jackets and trucker hats, whispering to one another, and occasionally glancing at her with expressions that ranged from suspicion to smug satisfaction. At the front of the room, behind a wide desk with a chipped gavel and a crooked nameplate, sat Judge Harold Kincaid. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't offer a greeting or a glance of recognition. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded over a small stack of papers, and said, "Miss Walker, please step forward." His voice was calm but cold, each syllable clipped like it had been sharpened ahead of time. Denise walked to the defense table, her eyes never leaving his, and placed both hands flat on the wood in front of her. She didn't speak yet. She wanted to see how far they would take this theater before she interrupted it. Kincaid opened the folder and read from it like it was a grocery list. Disturbance of the peace, verbal assault, possible physical intimidation of a local business owner. He paused, glanced over his glasses at her, and added, "Our records indicate you refused to provide identification when asked by the responding officer." That part was a lie, and she knew it. She'd offered her driver's license, but the deputy had waved it off, saying, "Don't need that where you're going." Denise cleared her throat, and replied steady but quiet. "Your Honor, I wasn't resisting arrest and I never raised my voice. I was burned by a waitress and followed to the bathroom by a man twice my size. I'd like to request an attorney." Kincaid barely blinked. "This isn't that kind of hearing, Miss Walker. This is a preliminary review. We're just determining if charges should be formally filed." He closed the folder and reached for his gavel. "You'll be held for 24 hours pending further review." Denise could feel the room tilting, not literally, but in the way that balance shifts before something topples. She straightened her back and took one breath. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she said clearly, letting each word land without apology. "Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. My badge is in my vehicle, along with credentials and a sealed brief from the Eastern District." The room shifted again this time, not in her head. There were murmurs in the pews, someone gasped audibly, and even the young deputy behind her stiffened, but Judge Kincaid didn't flinch. In fact, his lips curled slightly at the edges, as if he'd been waiting for her to play that card. "Well," he said after a beat, "that's quite the resume, Miss Walker. But this courtroom doesn't run on out-of-town titles. Here we go by behavior. And from what I've seen, yours was disruptive, hostile, and unbecoming of someone with such a distinguished background." He tapped the gavel once, not hard but firm. "You'll be remanded to county custody. No bail at this time." Denise didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply nodded once as if she were checking a box on a form. But inside, the realization settled like a stone. She wasn't up against incompetence. She was up against calculation. This wasn't about a sandwich or a diner or even an arrest. This was about shutting her down before she could open her mouth. And now that she had, the real storm was just beginning. Denise sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the holding cell, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, the skin at her knuckles pale from pressure as she stared at the dull concrete floor beneath her. The air inside the cell was cold and dry, laced with a faint metallic scent that seemed to cling to the back of her throat, no matter how many shallow breaths she took. The overhead light buzzed with a tired flicker, casting uneven shadows on the cinder-block walls that made the space feel smaller than it already was. Every few minutes, she could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, the heavy thump of boots echoing with the kind of weight that reminded her she wasn't free to leave. Not now, not without a fight. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, and tried to replay every second from the diner to the moment she was handcuffed. The way the waitress smirked after spilling coffee on her lap. The way the man at the counter had leaned in and blocked her path, not quite touching her but close enough to make her feel the warning in his breath, and then the shove. The scrape of her heels against the tile as she stumbled. The way her instincts kicked in before her mind caught up, defend, de-escalate, survive. That she was now in a jail cell for defending herself only confirmed what her gut had started, whispering the second she crossed the Pine Hollow County line. This place wasn't just broken, it was designed to break people like her. A faint knock rattled the bars and broke her trance. She looked up slowly to find Deputy Bowen standing outside the cell door, arms crossed, and a smug slant to his mouth that didn't even pretend to hide his satisfaction. "You're famous already," he said, nodding toward the hallway behind him. "Judge Kincaid wants to expedite your next hearing. We've got reputation management to worry about." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but beneath it was something colder, something that said he enjoyed watching the pieces fall apart. Denise stood without answering, adjusting the hem of her shirt where it had come untucked during the rough pat-down. As the cell door opened with a squeal of iron, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass window across the corridor, a woman tired, disheveled, but not yet broken. They led her not to the courtroom this time, but to a small, poorly lit room that felt more like an old storage closet converted into a deposition chamber. Inside, Judge Kincaid was already waiting, seated behind a metal desk with a single flickering lamp on top, its bulb casting shadows under his eyes that made him look older, wearier, but no less dangerous. He didn't look up as she was escorted in. Instead, he flipped through a manila folder that seemed far too thin to justify his expression of deep concern. When Denise took her seat across from him, the silence stretched longer than it needed to. "You know," Kincaid finally said, his fingers still shuffling through the papers, "people like you tend to think your titles travel with you, that they protect you." He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. "But here we do things differently. We handle our business without Washington poking around." Denise didn't flinch. "I'm not here on business," she replied evenly. "I was just driving through, until your people decided I was a threat." Kincaid smiled, but it was hollow and thin. "No one's trying to hurt you, Miss Walker," he said with mock gentleness. "But you came into my county, raised your voice, laid your hands on one of my constituents, and now you expect us to roll out the red carpet because you carry a federal badge." She watched him carefully, taking in every word, every tick of his jaw. This wasn't about justice or even discipline. It was about power, and she was a reminder of the one thing he couldn't control. "I don't expect a red carpet," she said, voice low, but steady. "Just the law, the real law." Kincaid chuckled, then closed the folder and slid it aside. "Well, Miss Walker, let me explain something to you plainly. Around here, the law is what I say it is, and right now I say you're a liability. So you're going to stay right where you are until we figure out what to do with you. That's not a threat, that's protocol." Denise felt her jaw tighten, her heartbeat slow to a dull roar behind her ears. She didn't bother responding. There was nothing to say to a man who'd already decided she didn't count. As they led her back to the holding cell, Denise's mind raced through every possible move. Her briefcase was still in the car, sealed with a DOJ lock that would take federal clearance to break, assuming it hadn't been misplaced already. Her phone was off-grid, and the local station wasn't exactly lining up to grant her a call. Her only shot would be to make noise, not in the courtroom but outside it. She needed a lifeline, someone who knew where she'd gone, someone who could start asking the right questions in the places where Kincaid's name didn't carry so much weight. Back in the cell, she sat again, slower this time, and leaned her head back against the wall. The cold seeped into her spine, but she welcomed it. It helped her think. Sam. If Sam had noticed she'd gone dark, she would have already been trying to trace her. They'd worked together long enough to understand the code, the fallback plan, the need to disappear loudly if necessary. Denise closed her eyes and focused on that thread of hope, however thin it felt in that moment. "You're going to have to work fast," she whispered under her breath to no one but herself, "because they're not wasting time here." Outside the cell, Bowen passed again, whistling low, tuneless, like a man who thought the storm had already passed. But inside that cell, the storm was still gathering, quiet, calculating, and ready to burn through the silence. By the third day, Denise Walker had memorized every crack in the cinder-block walls, every flicker of that failing light overhead, every pattern in the dull gray speckles of the concrete floor beneath her. The silence inside that holding cell wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hummed just beneath the skin, vibrating with questions no one was answering, and time no one was counting. Her watch had been taken. Her phone was gone. The small window high above her bunk let in nothing but a sliver of sky, and even that was too far to touch. She had no sense of morning or night anymore, only the rhythm of footsteps in the corridor and the scraping of meal trays through the slot in the door that passed for hospitality in Pine Hollow County Jail. She tried to keep her mind sharp by replaying courtroom statutes in her head, running through the 4th and 14th Amendments like mantras, not because she expected to recite them, but because they were the last structure she could control. She counted every misstep of due process, denied counsel, no phone call, a judge with open contempt, and knew that what was happening to her wasn't just unlawful, it was calculated. She was being held in the dark, both figuratively and literally, while whatever was happening outside that jailhouse continued without scrutiny. It was sometime between the second tray of cold grits and the next round of locked silence when she heard a softer sound, something more hesitant, footsteps that didn't carry the usual thud of steel-toed confidence. When the viewing slot scraped open, it wasn't Deputy Bowen's sneer or one of the local boys with dead eyes. It was a kid barely older than a college freshman, lean-framed and flushed with nerves, wearing a badge that looked too big for his chest and eyes that darted between fear and conscience. He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the metal frame. "Ma'am," he said quietly, almost like it hurt to speak. "You need anything." His voice cracked, and it wasn't just the nerves, it was guilt. Denise stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, palms open, her voice calm but clear. "Yes," she said. I need to call my colleague. It's a legal right, and I've been denied it 3 days straight." He didn't respond right away, just looked at her like he wanted to say something more but didn't have the words. Then, without warning, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a phone, a battered old burner with a cracked screen, the kind used by kids trying to stay off the grid. He didn't speak as he slid it through the slot. His hands trembled slightly. "Don't tell anyone I gave this to you," he whispered. "They've been blocking everything. Signals. Records. Even your intake paperwork disappeared off the system yesterday." Denise stared at him, the weight of what he said settling deep in her chest. "What's your name?" she asked. He paused, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Just call fast." And then he was gone, footsteps retreating down the hallway like the moment had never happened. Denise turned toward the farthest corner of the cell, crouched low behind the bench, and powered the phone on. No bars. No Wi-Fi. Just a faint blinking battery and a background screen that hadn't been changed in years. She entered the number from memory, Sam Lynn's direct line, and waited, the phone pressed against her ear as her pulse beat loud in her throat. 1 ring. 2. Then the line connected with a soft click and a voice she hadn't realized she'd missed until now. Denise Sam's tone was sharp, urgent, already halfway between panic and relief. "Where the hell are you? Your GPS vanished outside of Pine Hollow 2 days ago. I've been calling local stations, hospitals, hotels, nothing." Denise's voice was low, measured, but laced with exhaustion. "They've got me in holding. No official charges, no access to legal counsel. Judge Kincaid is sitting on a mountain of procedural violations, and I think it's more than personal." Sam swore under her breath, fingers clearly flying across a keyboard on the other end. "Is this line secure?" Denise glanced at the screen. "Barely. Burner phone from a scared kid with a badge. They're jamming the tower near the county line." There was a pause. Then Sam's voice dropped into that clipped, tactical tone she only used when things were worse than they appeared. "You're not just detained, D. You've been ghosted. I just checked DOJ logs. No report of your arrest, no booking info, nothing in the local docket. That judge is erasing you." Denise closed her eyes, the weight of those words landing like a stone. "I thought as much. But it's not just the judge. I think the sheriff's office is in on it too. There's a chain of command here that doesn't stop with bad coffee and petty charges." Sam took a breath, slow and deliberate. "Okay, listen carefully. I'm coming. I'm in Amarillo now, but I'll be in Pine Hollow before nightfall. In the meantime, send me anything you can. Names, times, descriptions. We'll build the case from the outside in." Denise looked at the dwindling battery icon, then said quietly, "This place is a cage, Sam, but it's also a cover. They're hiding something bigger." Before Sam could reply, the screen flickered, signal stuttering, battery warning, blinking red. "Get ready," Sam said. "If I'm right, the DOJ is going to rain hell on that courthouse. Just hold on." Then the line went dead. Denise sat still for a long moment, phone cradled loosely in her hands, her mind already filing away every detail. She would need to reconstruct everything from memory, the names on the uniforms, the makes of the vehicles parked outside the courthouse, the exact wording Kincaid used in that so-called hearing. This wasn't about proving her innocence anymore, it was about exposing the system that thought it could swallow her whole without consequence. She powered off the phone, wrapped it in a sock, and wedged it behind a loose brick near the floor. Outside, the fluorescent lights buzzed on cue, steady and lifeless. But somewhere far beyond these cinder-block walls, her voice had traveled. Someone knew, and that changed everything. It happened sometime after midnight, when the hallway outside her cell had gone completely still, and the chill in the air had crept bone-deep. Denise lay half awake on the cot, her back sore from the steel frame beneath the thin mattress, her eyes watching the shadows pulse faintly across the ceiling, as the light flickered in that tired, mechanical rhythm. The silence wasn't peaceful tonight. It had weight, the kind that signaled something wasn't right, something just beyond her vision, preparing to move. She sat up slowly, listening not with her ears, but with the instinct that had been honed through years in courtrooms, back offices, and interrogation rooms, the sense that you weren't alone, even when you couldn't see anyone. Then came the sound, soft at first, like the brushing of cloth against metal too smooth and slow to be a guard on rounds. She rose to her feet quietly, heart beating just a little faster, and stepped back into the dim corner near the bars, her hands unconsciously clenched at her sides. The lock didn't rattle. It simply clicked a clean metallic turn followed by the soft groan of the door swinging open. Two men entered without speaking. They were dressed in black from head to toe, ski masks covering their faces, gloved hands moving deliberately like they'd done this before and weren't worried about being caught. The taller one stepped toward her with purpose, his voice muffled but unmistakably male. "Don't scream," he said, not as a threat but a command, the kind of line meant to kill any instinct to resist. Denise stood her ground, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the thick air. "You know this is illegal," she said, her eyes locking on the shape of a crowbar held loosely in the shorter man's hand. "Every second you stay here makes it worse for you when this comes to light." The taller one laughed softly like she'd said something charming. "Lady, this ain't gonna come to light," he replied, reaching for her arm with practiced precision. She pulled back quickly, but his grip closed tight around her wrist, spinning her and pinning her arms behind her back before she could twist away. The other man pressed a sweaty palm over her mouth, muffling her voice as she struggled against their hold, the smell of oil and cheap cologne filling her nose as they dragged her into the hallway. There was no alarm, no guard to call out. The corridor was empty, the cameras dark, like the entire building had been told to look the other way. They moved quickly, hauling her through the back door and into the night air, the sudden cold slicing across her skin like a blade. A van idled near the loading dock, its engine low and steady exhaust curling into the sky like smoke from a funeral pyre. They shoved her inside the metal floor slick and stained the doors, slamming shut with finality behind them. Denise tried to twist away to kick her legs free, but one of them sat on her back while the other zip-tied her wrists. "You talk too much," one of them hissed, his voice tighter, now less composed. "Time to shut you up for good." She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She forced her mind to stay clear, to catalog every detail: the scrape of the tires on gravel, the faint rattle of loose tools in the back of the van, the subtle southern edge in the shorter man's voice. They didn't blindfold her, and that told her everything she needed to know. They didn't expect her to survive. The van bumped over uneven ground, jostling her against the side wall, the steel biting into her shoulder as the adrenaline began to surge through her veins. She counted every turn, every change in pitch from the engine, mentally mapping their path through the night. After what felt like 20 minutes, they stopped. The door opened to nothing but darkness and dry wind. One of them grabbed her ankles, yanked her down onto the dirt, and dragged her several yards into the desert. Her knees scraped against the ground, but she didn't cry out. They dumped her beside a low, rusted-out drainage ditch, barely visible in the moonlight. One of them pulled something from his coat, duct tape already unspooling, and knelt beside her. "Last chance," he muttered, yanking her upright by the collar. "You drop your story, disappear, and maybe you get to breathe a little longer." Denise stared at him through the dark, her breath steady despite the pain slicing through her arms. "I'm not the one who needs to disappear," she said evenly. "You are." He didn't like that. His fist landed fast across her jaw, sharp and mean, splitting the inside of her lip. Her head snapped to the side, but she didn't fall. Blood filled her mouth, warm and bitter. She turned her face slowly back toward him, blinking through the sting. That hesitation cost him. With a sudden twist of her hips, she threw her weight backwards, slamming into the man behind her. The shorter one stumbled, and in that blink of confusion, she kicked her foot up and caught the taller one in the shin. The blow wasn't hard, but it was enough. They hadn't secured her legs. She rolled, twisted, and drove her heel into the taller man's knee with everything she had left. He collapsed with a grunt, and she scrambled to her feet, zip-tied hands swinging uselessly in front of her body, aching from every angle. The van was behind her. Ahead lay only desert. No light, no road. Just a thin line of horizon and the faint glimmer of stars. She ran. The wind howled in her ears as shouts erupted behind her, commands, curses, threats, but she didn't look back. Every step felt like fire in her lungs, her thighs screaming, her jaw throbbing with every beat of her pulse. A single thought repeated in her mind like a drum: keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Somewhere in the distance, she saw a shimmer. Faint, orange, neon, a gas station flickering at the edge of night like salvation. She stumbled toward it, boots kicking up dust, arms still bound, mouth still bleeding, but her eyes locked on that one pinprick of hope. They had tried to bury her in silence. Now she was running straight into the noise. By the time Denise stumbled through the flickering glass doors of the gas station, her breath was shallow, her ribs aching with each inhale and her arms raw from the plastic ties. She'd finally managed to shred against a rusted piece of metal behind the dumpster. The floor inside was sticky beneath her boots, smelling of burnt coffee and dust, and the overhead lights buzzed like dying insects, casting a sickly orange glow that made everything feel surreal. The young clerk behind the counter didn't look up at first, lost in a cracked cell phone screen and a bag of corn chips, but when he finally noticed her bloody face and torn clothes, his eyes widened and his jaw dropped just slightly, like he'd seen something his brain hadn't yet found the words to name. Denise held up a trembling hand before he could speak, her voice hoarse but calm. "I don't want trouble. I just need the payphone." Her lips were split, her legs shaking, but her tone carried that same quiet authority she'd honed over 30 years of speaking truth to power. The boy hesitated, then nodded once, gesturing silently toward the far wall, where a yellowed payphone clung to the plaster like a relic from a time when people believed phones couldn't be tracked. She moved slowly, carefully, the entire left side of her body, screaming with pain, and leaned against the phone for balance as she dug into her pocket for the quarter she'd saved from a vending machine on her second day in holding. The line rang twice, then connected with that familiar click and a breathless voice on the other end. Denise Sam sounded like she hadn't slept in 2 days, and maybe she hadn't. There was panic behind her words, but also steel. "I just pulled into town. I lost you after the burner phone died. What happened?" Denise gripped the receiver tightly and kept her voice low. "They tried to take me out into the desert. 2 men. No uniforms, no badges. They weren't trying to scare me, they were trying to erase me." She glanced over her shoulder, watching the boy at the counter slowly back away into the employee office, clearly not wanting to get involved. "They said," Crane ordered it, "that if I kept talking I wouldn't make it past morning." There was a silence on the line, then the faint clatter of keys. Sam's voice returned colder this time, more focused. "That confirms it. I've been digging into Judge Harold Crane's finances. There are land transfers, backdoor deals, entire farms in the county that were taken under eminent domain and sold off to shell companies for pennies. And guess who signed every single one?" Denise let her eyes close for just a moment, not in defeat but in acknowledgement. "Crane." Sam exhaled hard, as though saying his name aloud made the corruption more real. "He's not just covering for his deputies, he's running a business built on stolen property and silenced witnesses. And he's scared because you didn't stay silent." Denise opened her eyes again, steadied her breath, and said, "It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've steamrolled and buried under paperwork and false arrests. If this place is a machine, I've seen the gears now, and they've got names." She lowered her voice even further. "I need you to find out what they're hiding in the courthouse basement. I heard one of the men mention a locked room, old records deeds, probably sealed by the judge himself." "Already on it," Sam replied, her voice sharpened into resolve. "I've got a USB full of preliminary files. If we can get something from that basement, we can trigger a federal review." Then softer, "Are you okay?" Denise didn't answer right away. Her reflection in the smudged payphone glass showed a woman who looked like she'd walked out of war. Her face was bruised hair, half-undone shirt torn along the shoulder where she'd twisted free from the van. And yet something in her eyes, something stubborn, unwavering, told her that she hadn't lost herself, not yet. "I'm not okay," she said finally, "but I'm awake." A pause. Then Sam whispered, "Good. Stay that way." Just as Denise was about to hang up, headlights sliced across the gas station window, flooding the interior with white. The clerk bolted out of the office, shouting, "Hey, that cruiser just parked out front! Lights off!" Denise's body tensed, as if her muscles knew what was coming before her mind could catch up. She dropped the phone, turned toward the back exit, and limped fast and low down the narrow aisle between snacks and freezer units, each step jolting pain through her ribs and shoulder. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, kicking up dirt and debris that danced like ash in the air. She ducked behind a stack of propane tanks, heart pounding, as 2 figures stepped out of the cruiser. Not deputies. No uniforms. One carried a crowbar, the other had a flashlight and something long wrapped in cloth slung over his shoulder. "She's still here," one of them muttered. And Denise heard the metallic clink of a weapon being drawn. She slipped deeper into the alley behind the station boots, crunching over broken glass, her eyes scanning for cover. The old delivery shed sat 20 yards away, door barely hanging on its hinges. She darted toward it, praying the hinges wouldn't betray her with a screech, and slid inside just as a flashlight beam swept past the spot where she'd been standing. Inside it smelled like rust and oil, and the only light came from a sliver of moon through the cracked ceiling. Denise crouched low behind an overturned shelving unit, her breath shallow, her hand clutching a broken broom handle like it was something more. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, crunching across gravel as if savoring the hunt. Then she heard them pause. "She's in there," one said. Denise gritted her teeth and braced herself. She wasn't ready to die in a place like this, not before the world knew exactly what Pine Hollow had tried to bury. The shed was silent now, except for the wind seeping through the broken slats in the walls, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and rust and desert sweat. Denise crouched behind the old shelving unit, her breath low and tight in her chest, every muscle in her legs burning from stillness as the footsteps outside grew fainter and more uncertain. She clutched the broken broom handle tighter in her right hand, her knuckles white, not because it would stop a bullet, but because it was the only thing she had. In the narrow beam of moonlight cutting through the cracked ceiling, her own shadow danced across the floor like a warning she couldn't ignore. She stayed low and still until she could no longer hear their voices, until even the cruiser's engine had faded into the distance before letting herself breathe fully again. Crawling out from behind the shelf, she rose slowly, every joint in her body protesting with pain, and staggered toward the back of the shed, where a warped service door leaned half off its hinges. Her legs shook beneath her, but she knew she had no choice but to move. Staying still in Pine Hollow meant disappearing, and she wasn't ready to be erased. She stepped out into the dark and kept to the alleyways, the uneven rhythm of her steps echoing faintly between dumpsters and sagging fences. The neon lights of the gas station behind her glowed like an afterimage, burned into memory, flickering as though they too were trying to disappear. She didn't stop walking until she reached a dirt service road that twisted behind a cluster of low industrial buildings, their windows boarded, their parking lots empty. Then she dropped to a crouch behind an overturned recycling bin, pulled out the burner phone she'd hidden earlier, and dialed the only number she trusted. Sam answered on the first ring, her voice low and fierce. "Tell me where you are." Denise's lips were cracked, her voice hoarse, but it came out steady. "Southeast of the station, maybe a mile out. I lost them for now." Sam exhaled sharply, the sound of her typing echoing faintly through the line. "I've got something. You're not going to like it." Denise didn't speak, just waited, because whatever Sam had found couldn't possibly be worse than what she'd already seen. "They hijacked the live stream," Sam said quietly. "The one I queued up with your statement, the DOJ documents, the first wave of Crane's signatures. Someone fed in doctored footage, edited clips, showing you assaulting a deputy and threatening the judge. It's already on local media. The sheriff called you a fugitive. There's a warrant out for your arrest." Denise didn't blink, didn't even look surprised. "That was the plan all along," she said after a long pause, her words more tired than angry. "They were never going to kill me quietly. They wanted me to be the villain, to prove them right." "You're trending," Sam continued, her voice tight with frustration. "But not the way we hoped. People are scared. They believe the clip." Denise wiped a hand across her mouth, smearing dried blood with dust, and looked up at the stars, as if searching for some version of herself she hadn't yet betrayed. "We need to flip it," she said, her tone firmer now. "We need to show the full story. The documents, the property thefts, the seal, deals, everything." Her fingers clenched around the burner phone. "We take this national. If we can't win their courtroom, we build one of our own." Sam was quiet for a long second, then said, "I've got one shot. A secure channel DOJ, eyes on standby, but we have to stream from a stable connection. We need a location with access, and we need it now." Denise scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing. "There's a motel off Highway 17. Blue neon sign, half the letters burned out. I passed it the night I arrived. It had Wi-Fi then. I'll meet you there." 15 minutes, Sam said, and the line went dead. Denise pushed herself back to her feet and started walking again, this time faster, her body screaming with pain, but her mind locked in. With every step, the picture grew sharper. The frame-up wasn't the endgame, it was just the distraction. Crane didn't want her discredited. He wanted her disbelieved. The documents she carried, the files Sam had hacked, they weren't threats to his reputation. They were torches held too close to dry kindling. She wasn't just a federal prosecutor now. She was the match. When she reached the motel, the blue neon buzzed faintly overhead, casting the gravel lot in a watery light. The front desk clerk didn't ask questions when she dropped a 50 on the counter, just slid her a key with a bored expression and pointed toward a stairwell. She climbed slowly, her limbs shaking, and let herself into a second-floor room that smelled of mildew and air freshener, then locked the door behind her and waited. Sam arrived 5 minutes later, breathless and focused, carrying a military-grade laptop and a folder thick with printed documents. "We go live now," she said, spreading everything out across the motel table. "Once it's out, they can't take it back." Denise nodded and sat down beside her, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the manila folder. Inside were deeds signed by Crane, property transfers approved by his court and shell company records, linking Pine Hollow farmland to out-of-state investors who never once stepped foot on the land they stole. She leaned into the camera, her voice quiet but unshaking. "My name is Denise Walker. I'm a federal prosecutor, and if you're watching this, then they didn't succeed in burying me." Behind her, the blue neon flickered, and outside, somewhere beyond the motel walls, Pine Hollow braced for the truth. The motel room was small and musty, its curtains drawn tight against the pre-dawn light that threatened to spill across a desert sky still bruised with shadows. Denise sat at the edge of the bed's shoulders, squared eyes locked on the glow of the laptop screen as Sam adjusted the webcam with a steady hand and a clenched jaw. The silence between them wasn't tense, it was heavy-weighted, with the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. The truth was loaded, ready to be released into a world that might not be prepared to hear it, but silence had already done too much damage in Pine Hollow. The live stream went up at 6:08 a.m., just as the sun cracked open over the horizon, bleeding gold through a torn sky. The feed was simple, no graphics, no production, just a worn-out woman in a torn shirt, bruises across her cheek and dirt in the creases of her knuckles, telling the truth into a camera that couldn't look away. Denise began quietly, her voice low but steady, her words carefully chosen, not for drama but for clarity. "My name is Denise Walker. I am a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. I have been unlawfully detained, hunted, and framed by a network of officials operating in Pine Hollow County." Sam didn't speak as she cued the files, court documents, property records, altered police logs, all fed into the stream in real-time receipts for a system built to erase people like Denise before they could speak. As the numbers on the viewer count ticked upward, 200, then 500, then 1300, Denise continued, her voice growing firmer. "I have evidence that Judge Harold Crane has signed off on dozens of illegal property transfers targeting Black and Indigenous landowners under the guise of eminent domain. These properties were funneled into shell companies tied to private developers, while the sheriff's department used false arrests and intimidation to silence dissent." Her breath hitched briefly, but she didn't stop. This isn't about one woman. It's about everyone this town thought it could swallow whole. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling slightly, but her spine was straight, her gaze unflinching as she stared down the lens, like it was the only judge she still trusted. Sam hit the final command, sending the files to 3 separate secure servers, DOJ inboxes, and a cloud-based Newswire archive. Then she leaned back, ran a hand through her hair, and muttered, "It's done. They can't scrub this now." For a moment there was quiet. The kind that doesn't come from relief, but from the realization that you've just set fire to something and now have no choice but to watch it burn. But the moment didn't last. It started with a low rumble like a truck engine approaching too fast, followed by the sudden shudder of glass panes rattling in their frames. Denise stood instinct, kicking in before reason, just as the wall of the motel shook, with a force that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Sam lunged toward her, grabbing her by the shoulder, pulling her to the floor a split second before the window exploded inward in a shower of shards and dust. The blast wasn't close enough to kill, but it was damn sure close enough to warn. Outside, smoke curled up into the morning, air thick and black, while flames licked across the parking lot like fingers reaching for more. Denise coughed through the haze, her ears ringing the sound of screaming tires and distant shouting cutting through the chaos like blades. Sam rolled to her feet, coughing hard, and pulled Denise up by the arm. "We have to go. Now." They moved fast, ducking through the smoke and debris, slipping past a broken stairwell where the outer wall had buckled inward. From the edge of the parking lot, Denise looked back and saw the source, Sam's rental car, or what was left of it, now reduced to a burning carcass. "That was meant for us," she said, her voice flat with disbelief. Sam nodded, eyes scanning the street. "Or for the laptop." Sirens wailed in the distance, but they didn't sound like rescue. They sounded like pursuit. The cruisers would come, but not to help. Not here. Not after what they'd just done. Denise spotted a narrow alley between two vacant storefronts and pointed. "There. Cut through the back. I know a way out." They ran together, ducking behind trash bins and broken fences, until they reached an old drainage tunnel that ran beneath the edge of town, a place Denise had memorized from the maps she'd seen in the records Sam had uncovered. They crouched in the dark, breath catching in their throats, the glow of the fire behind them slowly fading. When they reached the other side, Denise paused, hands on her knees, her body aching but her mind sharp with something stronger than adrenaline. She looked at Sam, who was already pulling a backup drive from her bag. "We saved the files," she said, her voice shaking but proud. "They're still out there. People are watching." Denise nodded slowly, straightening her gaze, focused now not on the fire, not on the past, but on the courthouse. She could just barely see in the distance, its old bell tower catching the sun like a false beacon. "Then it's time we stop running," she said. "It's time we walk through that door and make them see us coming." Sam stared at her for a second, then smiled faintly. "You're serious?" Denise turned, brushing dirt from her clothes, the last of the smoke curling around her like armor. "Dead serious," she said. "We've lit the match. Now let's watch who chokes first." And together they stepped back into the morning, ready to bring the fire to the place where it all began. The courthouse rose from the desert dust, like something meant to impress, but long since forgotten. Faded bricks, sun-bleached columns, and windows that reflected nothing but sky. Denise and Sam approached from the side, weaving through alleys still slick with ash from the motel explosion, their breath measured but quickened by the steady hum of risk that vibrated through their bones. Neither of them spoke as they reached the staff entrance, just a steel door framed by a concrete loading dock, the kind used for deliveries, not justice. Denise reached for the handle, her fingers pausing just long enough for Sam to whisper, "You sure we're ready for this?" Denise didn't look at her. Her voice was low, quiet as a confession. "We're past ready." Then she pulled the door open and stepped inside. The hallway was dark, lit only by the dim emergency lights that flickered along the floor like breadcrumbs, guiding them through something more maze than institution. The building was silent too early for court to be in session, too early for its secrets to have stirred, but Denise could feel it all waiting in the walls, pressing down with the weight of 100 silenced voices. They moved carefully, staying close to the edges, avoiding the cameras Sam had already mapped out. She'd hacked into the building system hours earlier and looped the feeds for just long enough to buy them a window, 15 minutes, maybe 20 if they were lucky. At the bottom of the east stairwell, behind a locked panel in the foundation wall, they found the entrance to the basement records room. Sam pulled out the narrow key she'd found buried in a decades-old city planning file, slid it into the lock and turned until they heard the soft click of access granted. Denise opened the door and stepped into the dark, musty room, its shelves stacked high with dusty boxes, leather-bound ledgers, and filing cabinets no one had touched in years. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of mildew-old paper and something else like secrecy left too long to rot. They moved quickly, each step echoing softly in the stillness, as Sam opened drawers and scanned labels, her fingers flying across the folders, while Denise checked the wall for a second entrance, a vent, anything that might give them more than one way out. "Crane's signature will be here," Sam muttered almost to herself. "These are sealed orders, no digital record, just ink and nerve." Denise ran a hand along the edge of a cabinet, feeling the etched initials of long-dead clerks, the forgotten bureaucracy of quiet corruption. "He never expected anyone to look this deep," she said. "He thought the courthouse was his fortress." Sam pulled out a folder, blew the dust from its cover, and opened it wide. Inside were handwritten orders signed and stamped, approving the seizure of land from families across the county names. Denise recognized from interviews, arrests, even obituaries. "This is it," Sam whispered. "This is the whole blueprint." Denise leaned over her shoulder, scanning the details. There were diagrams, coordinates, notations that read like instructions for theft: unoccupied, push order through, use Bowen if needed. The deputy's name scribbled in margin notes like a tool, not a person. Denise's mouth tightened as she grabbed a portable scanner from Sam's bag and started uploading the documents to the backup cloud. "You hear that?" Sam asked, suddenly pausing mid-swipe, her eyes fixed on the vent shaft above them. Denise froze, listening. A metallic echo. Not from them. Footsteps. Heavy. Unhurried. Coming closer. "Time's up," Denise said, reaching for the flash drive. Sam shut the folder, yanked the drive free, and stuffed it into her pocket. "Back door." Denise nodded, gesturing toward the shadowed corridor that led deeper into the sub-basement where the maintenance crew used to store cleaning supplies. They ran without speaking, their shoes silent against the old linoleum, the sound of pursuit getting louder, closer, more real with each turn. They reached the service tunnel and ducked low the narrow space, barely enough for them to pass single file. Behind them a voice called out loud, commanding and unmistakably cruel. "Walker, you're making this worse." It was Bowen. Denise didn't turn. She just kept moving, breathing harder now, the burn of exhaustion climbing up her spine as they reached the hatch at the tunnel's end. Sam pushed it open with both hands and climbed up first, pulling Denise through with a grunt. They emerged behind the courthouse, blinking into sunlight that cut across their faces like a blade. "We have to split," Denise said, already scanning the street. "No," Sam replied, shaking her head. "We've got to deliver this in person. You need to testify. You're the story now." Denise opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She saw it in Sam's eyes. Truth, not strategy. No more hiding, no more running. She reached into her jacket, pulled out the drive, and stared at it like it was a verdict waiting to be read aloud. "Then we go to the press," she said. "To the state office. The feds. We go where he can't pull the strings." They slipped into a waiting sedan, parked 2 blocks down, borrowed from a journalist Sam had contacted the night before. The woman was waiting at a safe house nearby, ready to stream the files to verify to publish. Denise slid into the back seat and looked out the window as the courthouse grew smaller behind them, its bricks crumbling under the weight of what they'd just taken. As they drove away, sirens wailed in the distance, not coming for them, not this time, but chasing a truth too loud to ignore. And somewhere inside her, Denise knew this was the beginning of the end. But not hers. Theirs. The safe house was tucked behind an abandoned feed store, just outside the town limits, hidden beneath a canopy of cottonwoods, whose twisted branches filtered the morning light like old lace. Denise sat at the scarred wooden table in the center of the room, the drive clenched in her fingers, her eyes scanning the small space as if committing every detail to memory. The walls were bare except for an old radio nailed above the sink, softly whispering static from a forgotten frequency, and a single oscillating fan moved the warm air just enough to remind them they were still breathing. Sam stood by the window, watching the road, her shoulders tense beneath the loose denim jacket she'd borrowed from the reporter, now pacing quietly in the next room. The journalist's name was Nina. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, eyes sharp enough to slice through spin and silence. She'd been tipped off by Sam 2 days earlier, and when she saw the first round of live-streamed footage, she'd driven through the night to meet them. Now she was syncing the final upload, the sealed orders from the courthouse basement, the signatures from Judge Crane, the mapped transactions, and forged affidavits that painted Pine Hollow as a machine designed not for justice, but for quiet theft. Denise exhaled slowly, finally sliding the drive across the table. "This is everything," she said. "Not just what they did to me, but what they've done to this town for years." Nina nodded, opening her laptop with fingers that moved quickly, but precisely the way people do when they know time is thin. "You're sure you want to be on record?" she asked without looking up. "Because once this goes live, you're not just a target, you're a threat." Denise smiled, but it wasn't soft. It was the kind of smile forged in courtrooms and holding cells, where justice was something you had to drag out of the dark. "I've been both before," she said, "but this time I'm not alone. The upload began a progress bar creeping across the screen like a slow heartbeat. Sam pulled a second laptop from her bag, synced it to a private DOJ channel, and began pinging federal contacts with real-time data. The documents were paired with metadata location stamps and video footage, the kind of airtight packet that couldn't be swept away with a press release or a hollow apology. This wasn't a leak, it was a controlled detonation. Outside, the breeze shifted, and the faint sound of sirens began to build. Not urgent, not yet, but searching. Denise stood stretching her back, wincing slightly, as the bruises along her ribs reminded her that survival came with a cost. She moved to the window and stood beside Sam, their shoulders nearly touching, as they watched the sunlight stretch across the cracked asphalt of the road ahead. "You think they'll believe it?" Sam asked, her voice quieter, now almost vulnerable. Denise nodded slowly. "Some won't, some never will. But the ones who matter, the ones with power and conscience, they'll see what's been hiding in plain sight." Behind them, Nina let out a breath and turned the screen toward them. "It's live. Press requests are already hitting my inbox. And DOJ just issued a statement. They're opening a full investigation into Judge Crane and Sheriff Bowen." Denise felt it before she heard it, the shift in the room, like something had been released, a tension unwinding after being wound too tight for too long. She walked back to the table, placed both hands on the surface, and looked straight at Nina. "Now we finish it." At that moment, a black SUV pulled into view, tires crunching slowly over gravel. Sam's hand moved instinctively to her waistband, but Nina raised a hand. "Relax. That's them. Federal marshals. I sent the coordinates 30 minutes ago. 2 men and a woman stepped out, their suits wrinkled from travel, but their eyes alert. One flashed a badge through the window before knocking once sharp and direct. Denise opened the door and was met with the firm grip of a deputy marshal who introduced himself as Agent Keller. "We've reviewed the packet," he said. "The evidence is solid. We have a judge on standby for emergency warrants and a team already en route to secure the courthouse." Denise nodded once, calm and resolute. "Then I want to be there when they walk him out." Keller didn't flinch. "That can be arranged." By the time they reached Pine Hollow's town square, the sun was high and unrelenting, casting long shadows from the statue of the county's founder to the steps of the courthouse itself. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by rumors and sirens whispering in tight circles as word spread faster than official statements ever could. Denise stepped out of the SUV and was met by flashing cameras, wide eyes, and the murmurs of a town finally waking from decades of forced silence. Judge Crane was still inside, unaware that the ground had shifted beneath him. The marshals moved efficiently, respectfully entering through the front, with enough presence to leave no doubt that something real was happening. Moments later, the doors opened again, and the judge was led out in handcuffs, his face pale, jaw, clenched lips tight in a line that refused to acknowledge anything. But his eyes locked on Denise as he passed her, and in that glance there was no question he knew exactly who had done this. Denise didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood with her arms crossed and watched as power was unseated, not with rage but with truth. Beside her, Sam whispered, "You did it." But Denise shook her head. "We did it. And we're not done yet," because she knew the courthouse was just one building and Pine Hollow was just one town. But in a country full of places like it, someone had to be the first to say no louder than silence, to stand when others were made to kneel. And now she had a voice the whole world could hear. The holding room inside the Pine Hollow Federal Annex was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles not from peace but from exhaustion, the heavy stillness that comes after the storm has passed, but before the reckoning truly begins. Denise sat on a wooden bench, hands folded in her lap, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the floor, through the narrow blinds, casting long stripes of gold against the pale linoleum. Her shoulder ached from where she'd been slammed into the back of a patrol car days earlier, and her ribs still pulsed with every deep breath, a dull reminder that healing had no intention of rushing for her. The courthouse square outside had emptied, but she could still hear the murmurs of voices through the walls, soft and persistent like the ocean just beyond a thin pane of glass. She was waiting for her testimony to begin, but part of her knew that it had already started, that every step she'd taken to get here, every name she'd spoken aloud, every document uploaded, every bruise, not hidden, every camera she looked, straight into, had already become part of the public record. But this was different. This was sworn oath and federal attention. This was no longer about survival. It was about cementing the truth line by line before anyone else could rewrite it. Sam stepped into the room quietly, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Her clothes were rumpled, eyes ringed with fatigue, but the fire behind them hadn't dimmed. She handed Denise a glass of water, then sat beside her without a word, letting the silence stretch until it felt safe enough to breathe in. "They say the DOJ team is already in motion," Sam murmured. 5 warrants served this morning. Bowen's house, 2 sheriff's deputies, and that property management firm in Amarillo. She let out a small breath. "And the mayor's office just announced a public audit of the county treasury. Guess someone's finally checking the math." Denise nodded slowly, sipping the water and savoring the coolness against her throat. Her voice when it came was steady but quiet. "I always thought it would feel more like winning." Sam looked over one brow, lifting gently. "Does it?" Denise didn't answer right away. She watched a single dust mote drift through the air, spinning slowly in a shaft of light, like it had nowhere urgent to be. "It feels like justice trying to remember how to stand up straight," she said, "like something old, trying to become something new and not knowing if the world will allow it." Sam nodded, once solemn, like she knew exactly what that meant. When the marshal opened the door to escort them to the hearing room, Denise stood first, her back tall. Despite the pain, her chin lifted, not out of pride, but out of a refusal to lower it for anyone else ever again. The hallway smelled of old paper and floor wax, and every step of her boots against the tile echoed with a steadiness that no longer surprised her. She wasn't walking in as a witness to her own story. She was walking in as someone prepared to speak for everyone. Pine Hollow had tried to silence. Inside, the courtroom was brighter than it had been the last time she stood here, though maybe it was just her that had changed. A new federal judge sat behind the bench, flanked by agents and legal aides, while members of the media and DOJ observers lined the rear gallery in respectful silence. Judge Evelyn Hart, known for her unshakable presence and clean record, looked over her glasses and gestured to the witness stand. Denise took her seat and adjusted the microphone with calm fingers. She looked out over the room, not searching for approval but anchoring herself in the reality of what this moment meant. Her opening words were not dramatic or rehearsed. They were simple, quiet, and devastatingly clear. "My name is Denise Walker. I am a federal prosecutor, and I was nearly erased for finding out the truth." What followed wasn't just a retelling of events, it was a dismantling of a system. She spoke of the forged deeds, the illegal seizures, the shadow network that had operated under the guise of local government for years. She recounted the diner, the courthouse, the gas station, the van in the desert. She named the deputies, detailed the attacks, and explained every piece of evidence she and Sam had uncovered, laying it bare in front of the judge, the DOJ, and a public that had finally started to listen. As she spoke, she watched people shift in their seats, not in discomfort, but in awareness. It was the first time the whole room felt like it was seeing Pine Hollow not as a place, but as a story they now had a responsibility to finish. When the judge asked her if she had anything else to add, Denise paused, then leaned into the microphone, her voice soft but unwavering. "There are people whose names you won't find in any report. People who lost their land, their homes, their families. People who were told over and over again that what was happening to them was legal, even when they knew in their bones it was anything but." She exhaled. "I didn't come here to be a hero. I came here because silence wasn't an option anymore." And in that silence, as the courtroom held its breath, the gavel fell, not like punishment, but like punctuation, final, necessary, and true. After the testimony, as the media swarmed and the investigators spoke in low tones outside the courthouse steps, Denise stood beside Sam, watching the town square swell with people she didn't recognize, some holding signs, some holding hope, some holding the kind of quiet respect that doesn't need words. A reporter approached, microphone outstretched, asking how she felt now that it was all out in the open. Denise looked into the lens not with fire, but with something deeper. "I feel like we just stopped something that never should have started, and maybe gave people permission to start over." Then she turned away, not to escape the spotlight, but to remind it that it wasn't hers to keep. It belonged to all the stories still waiting to be told. The morning after her testimony, Denise stood at the edge of the motel balcony arms, resting on the rusted railing, watching the sun rise over the dusty horizon, like it was something holy and hard-earned. The air was dry, tinged with smoke from somewhere far off, and the sky glowed a bruised orange that bled into pale blue the way skies do after long nights that almost broke you. Below her, Pine Hollow was quiet for once, not silent, but quiet, in a way that felt like something was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Now that the truth had been cracked open and poured into every crack and crevice, this place once used to hide its shame. She could still hear the echoes of the day before gavel strikes camera shutters, the quiet weight of her own voice speaking aloud, things that had nearly killed her to carry. Her body ached in a way no medicine could really fix, not just from the bruises and broken skin, but from the months of holding tension in her chest, like a second set of lungs. Behind her, Sam was packing the last of their things, folding up files and cables with a practiced urgency that came not from fear but from resolve, like someone who'd stopped waiting for permission and started moving toward justice on her own terms. When Sam stepped out and handed her a coffee, their eyes met with a look that didn't need words. The kind of look shared between people who had seen each other through hell and come out on the other side, not whole but still standing. "News just broke," Sam said quietly, sipping from her own cup. "The feds raided Crane's private ranch. Found a locked archive thumb, drives money trails, everything we suspected." She hesitated, then added, "He tried to burn half of it before they broke the door down." Denise nodded slowly, not surprised but still unsettled. That man was ready to torch the whole system if it meant hiding what he'd done. Sam looked out toward the town, her voice more thoughtful now. "But it's not just him anymore. There's a list, more names, people in 3 other counties tied to the same shell corporations. This thing runs deep, Dee." "I know," Denise said, her voice low but firm. "And we've only just hit the first layer." Inside her phone buzzed once, then twice. A text from a DOJ contact, federal indictment approved. Crane and Bowen facing multiple life sentences, national task force to follow. It should have felt like victory, and maybe it did somewhere deep down. But what it felt like more than anything was a kind of stillness, like she'd stopped swimming upstream just long enough to notice how far the current really ran. They checked out without fanfare, the clerk barely glancing up from his crossword puzzle, the parking lot already baking under the rising sun. As they pulled out onto the main road, Denise looked back one last time at the town that had nearly ended her. Not to mourn it and not to curse it, but to remember it exactly as it was so she could help ensure no other place could become what Pine Hollow had become. The drive out was quiet for the first half hour, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the engine humming steady beneath them. But when they crossed the county line, Denise spoke again, not to Sam, but to the space between them. "I got a note this morning," she said, pulling it from her pocket and unfolding it slowly. Sam glanced over, brows furrowed. "From who?" Denise's eyes didn't leave the road. It didn't say. Just a single sentence. She handed it to Sam without another word. Sam read it aloud, her voice almost disbelieving. "You may have exposed the judge, but the king is still watching." They sat with it in silence, the weight of those words pressing into the quiet like a thumb against a bruise. Sam finally spoke, her voice laced with fire. "Then we keep going. We don't stop just because the light caught one monster's face." Denise smiled faintly, her hands steady on the wheel. "Number. We don't stop. We get smarter, louder, harder to erase." As the road curved through the hills and disappeared into open sky, Denise felt something shift, not an ending, but the opening of a new chapter, one written in the ink of survival and lit by the slow-burning flame of accountability. She wasn't going back to her office, not yet. There were other names, other counties, other systems rotting quietly beneath polite smiles and legal documents. And she was going to find them all. By the time they hit the interstate, Sam had pulled out her laptop again, cross-referencing names from the ranch raid with campaign donations, zoning maps, and sealed court records. Denise drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, not out of fear but out of habit, because once they came for you, you never forgot how fast the quiet could turn violent. But there was no siren this time, no van, no masked men waiting at the next gas station. There was just the road. And the fire they had started still burning behind them, no longer contained, no longer hidden. Before the sun reached its peak, Denise made a call to Washington not to report in but to request reassignment. Not back to D.C., not to any office with elevators and espresso machines, but to the field. She wanted every case file tied to rural corruption, every cold lead that smelled like intimidation and land theft. She wanted the list Crane was part of, and the ones who had never needed to get their hands dirty because they had others to do it for them. "Send it all," she told the director's aide. "No filters, no politics. I want everything. No one else wants to touch." When she hung up, Sam looked over and said simply, "So what now?" Denise met her gaze with something clearer than anger, deeper than pain. "Now," she said, "we go hunting." And in that moment, with the wind sliding across the windshield, and the road unwinding like a ribbon of truth before them, it was clear the system had tried to silence the wrong woman. And the woman it tried to erase had become something it couldn't outrun. Not now, not ever. What Denise Walker's story teaches us is something many of us already know in our bones. When systems fail, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, buried under paperwork and polite smiles. But silence doesn't mean safety. Injustice thrives in silence, and the moment someone dares to speak, truly speak, they don't just defend themselves, they give voice to others who've been buried beneath the weight of fear, loss, and forgotten names. For those of us watching, especially those in our later years who've lived through decades of promises and disappointments, this story reminds us we're never too old to see clearly, to demand better, or to stand alongside those who refuse to bow down. We carry the wisdom of experience, the power of memory, and the responsibility to ensure the next generation inherits something stronger than survival. They inherit courage. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've witnessed, lived through, or quietly carried, don't let it sit. Share it, pass it on, talk about it. Because stories like this don't just belong to one woman, they belong to all of us. And if you believe in truth, in accountability, and in the strength of one voice backed by many, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that speak to justice, resilience, and the fight that never ends no matter your age. Because we're not done yet. And neither are you.